California is the most populated state in America. 39 million people, thousands of towns, hundreds of back roads that nobody talks about. And tucked inside all of that are stories that locals have been quietly passing down for decades. Tonight, we're putting 9 of them on the screen. Before we go, if you haven't subscribed yet, do that right now and hit the bell, so you actually see the new episodes when they drop. And I want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me where in California you've camped, where you've hiked, where you've felt that particular quality of being in a wild place and knowing, really knowing, that you are not alone. All right, let's go. Story 1. My name is Deirdre Fallon, 34-year-old. The fog came in low and fast, the way it always does on the Lost Coast, rolling in off the water in slow, fat curtains that swallow the beach in sections. And by the time I had my tent staked and my sleeping bag unrolled inside it, Kooski Creek was just a sound behind me rather than a thing I could see. The visibility was maybe 40 yards. I've seen worse out there. I've seen the kind of fog where your hand disappears at arm's length, where the ocean itself becomes theoretical. Something you know is present but cannot actually locate with your eyes. I'd driven up from Fortuna on a Thursday in early October by myself, which people who know me know is not unusual. I've done solo sections of the Lost Coast multiple times, and I know the tide tables because the tide tables on that stretch are not optional knowledge, but survival knowledge. There are sections of beach that become impassable at high tide, cliff face dropping straight into the water with no shelf to stand on. I had those tables in my head and on a laminated card in the top of my pack. I had a satellite communicator clipped to my left shoulder strap, the kind that lets you send a message even when there's no cell signal, which there isn't. Not on the Lost Coast, not once you're past the first mile. I had good gear, good boots. The particular kind of preparedness that relaxes you rather than making you anxious, that loosens your shoulders and lets you be in a place rather than worried about it. I'd eaten well before leaving, stopped in Fortuna for a real meal, gas station coffee in the cup holder the whole drive up the 101. The gravel parking lot at the Mattole River trailhead was empty when I left it around noon, my car the only thing in it, which meant the northbound trail would be mine. That suited me perfectly. I set up camp near Kooski Creek because I like running water and I like having a landmark to orient to in the dark. I cooked on my small stove, a pouch of lentil soup that I've been bringing on trips for years, not because it's the best food I've ever eaten, but because I've come to associate its smell with the particular feeling of being exactly where I want to be. I ate it slowly, watching the fog move across the beach. Fog on the Lost Coast has a companion quality that I've always found more comforting than lonely. It closes the world down. It makes the immediate more immediate. The ocean was right there, 30 yards off, but muffled. The sound of the waves became something ambient and low, like white noise, like a heater running in a room where you're almost asleep. I got into the tent around 8:30. The sky outside was not fully dark yet. That specific shade of gray-blue that October brings to the northern coast, where the light does not leave all at once but evacuates in stages, and you're never quite sure when night officially arrived. I read on my phone for a while. I was in the middle of a novel I've since completely forgotten the title of. Something about a family, something set in the Midwest. I remember turning pages without fully reading them. Eventually, I put the phone down and lay on my back and listened to the fog and the water. The Lost Coast does a thing at night with sound. The cliffs to the east are high and close, and they reflect and redirect sound in ways that are never quite predictable. A wave surge through a narrow channel will produce something close to a rhythmic percussion. Wind pulling across a rock formation at a specific angle will produce something that resembles, briefly and convincingly, the cadence of human speech. I knew this. I'd experienced it before and traced it to its source and moved on. I was not a person who spooked easily in the dark out there. I want to be clear about that. What I heard around 11 was not that. My name, spoken at conversational volume. Not called out, not shouted with urgency, not shaped by the wind into an accidental approximation. Spoken the way you speak someone's name when you want their attention from across a room. Deirdre, one word, the D sharp and then the rest of it. All 3 syllables, spoken with the particular rhythm that my name has when spoken by someone who knows it. I went very still. My sleeping bag was warm and I had been very close to sleep, and the transition from near sleep to full alert is a physical thing, a tightening across the chest and a sharpening of focus that I can still feel if I think about it too carefully. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling of the tent, which was this faded off-white color from years of sun and use, and I listened. 2 minutes. Nothing but the ocean and the fog and the small sounds of the creek behind me. I measured the 2 minutes by counting my breaths, which were slower than normal, the kind of controlled breathing you do when you are trying very hard to be quiet. Then from the direction of the waterline, from the south and slightly seaward, a sound. It was rhythmic, soft, the particular compressed sound of weight moving on wet sand, the uneven intervals of something navigating uneven terrain. I have walked that beach. I know what footsteps sound like on it. The pattern was not regular the way wave surge is regular. It was irregular in the way that footsteps are irregular, with the small variations of weight and pace and surface that come from something alive moving through space. The footsteps came closer and stopped. I did not immediately move. I lay in my sleeping bag with my hand on my headlamp, the one I keep in the left mesh pocket of my tent. Same spot every trip, and I thought about what I was dealing with. Another camper, possibly, who'd come in late and was checking the area for a site. A ranger doing a late walkthrough, though rangers rarely walk this section after dark. Something else. I let myself hold all 3 possibilities without committing to any of them. The footsteps had stopped approximately 20 feet from my tent. I know it was 20 feet because I paced it in the morning, standing at my tent door and walking toward the water line to the spot where something had stood long enough to leave an irregular depression in the wet sand, a shallow scoop where weight had shifted and redistributed over time. But that was the morning. In the moment, I could only know that what was outside my tent was close and was not moving. It stayed there long enough for my knees to start aching from the position I'd moved into without realizing it. Half upright in my sleeping bag, weight on my knees, headlamp in my hand. Long enough for the fog to shift and the sound of the ocean to change slightly as the tide moved. Long enough that I lowered myself back onto my side very slowly, millimeter by millimeter, without making a sound, and simply lay there and listened. The birds that nest in the cliff grass were silent. The small mammals that move through beach grass in the dark at night were silent. The only sound was the ocean, which is always the ocean, indifferent to everything on land, rolling forward and pulling back in its ancient rhythm. And the thing outside my tent stood in that silence and did not move. Then it moved, not back the way it had come, sideways, parallel to my tent, moving south at a pace I can only describe as unhurried and deliberate. The compression of wet sand was very clear in the fog-muffled air, a soft rhythmic sound for perhaps 30 or 40 seconds. And then silence. I waited. I waited a long time. I did not open the tent. I lay there until the sky outside went from absolute black to a dark charcoal, and then to the first real gray of pre-dawn. And then I unzipped the flap all at once, fast, and stepped out into the cold, salt air and turned in a full circle with my headlamp on. Empty beach in both directions. The fog was lifting slightly in thin ribbons off the water. The creek behind me ran on, indifferent. I walked to the spot where the depression was in the sand and stood in it and looked north, which was the direction the sound had come from initially. I looked south, which was the direction it had gone. I shined my headlamp across the wet sand in both directions and Saw nothing but sand and the small craters of retreating waves. I packed up my camp in the gray early light and continued south, which was my planned direction anyway. I didn't see another hiker that morning. I reached the Matole trailhead by early afternoon, my car exactly where I'd left it. The gravel lot empty except for one other vehicle now, a green truck with fishing gear in the bed that hadn't been there when I arrived. I drove back toward Eureka and then south. I had the radio on. I stopped for coffee somewhere on the 101 and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, watching the cars go by on the highway, and thought about the voice, about the way it had my name exactly right, not close, exactly right. I've spent a great deal of time since then constructing alternative explanations. The acoustics of the fog and the cliff face, sleep deprivation. I'd been awake since 6. The particular auditory hallucinations that can come with the sensory narrowing of a foggy night alone on a remote beach. I've held all of these explanations up to the light and examined them seriously because I'm a person who believes in examining things seriously before drawing conclusions. But here's what I keep coming back to. I know my name when I hear it. I know the shape of it and the sound of it and the weight of its syllables when someone speaks it who knows me. And whatever spoke it outside my tent in the fog on the Lost Coast knew all of those things. Story 2. Altitude does something to your thinking that you can't fully appreciate until you're up in it. At 5,000 feet, the thoughts slow down slightly, the edges go soft. The kind of quick lateral thinking that you do all day at sea level becomes something you have to actively work at. I know this from experience because I've spent a lot of time in the High Sierra, and I've learned to account for it, to make decisions more carefully, to double-check myself when I'm tired and high. I'd started from Rhodes End in Kings Canyon at 5:30 in the morning, which is early even by Sierra standards. But the pass I was aiming for gets afternoon thunderstorms in late September, and you don't want to be on exposed granite when those come in. My buddy Theo had planned to come with me, but turned back at the creek crossing below Gardener Lake because his left knee had been giving him trouble since the last trip, and the switchbacks ahead were not going to be kind to it. We agreed he'd wait at a lower site and I'd continue alone. We've done this before, we're both comfortable with it. I had my permit stamped at the backcountry office the day before. I had an itinerary filed, which lists where I plan to camp and when I plan to return, so that if I don't show up, someone knows where to start looking. I had a personal locator beacon. I had enough food for 4 nights and the experience to know how to use it efficiently. All the responsible things. I want to be clear about all the responsible things because what I'm about to describe is not the result of being unprepared or careless or frightened of the dark. Gardener Basin sits in a broad granite bowl above 10,000 feet, and the lake at its center is the color of a mood you don't have a name for, a blue that falls somewhere between sky and stone, a blue that is itself and cannot be compared usefully to anything. I set up camp on a flat granite ledge just above the water, in a spot that was wind protected on 2 sides by a low ridge and open to the east. I remember sitting with my pack still on my back for longer than I needed to, just looking at the water. The day had gone from hard to beautiful, and there was the specific pleasure of knowing I was at exactly the right altitude in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. I ate cold food that night, crackers with peanut butter and some kind of compressed energy bar and half an apple I'd been carrying since the trailhead, which was bruised by then but still good. I'd brought a flask of whiskey and took 2 measured pulls of it and put it away, because I was alone at elevation, and moderation is wisdom. The sky at full dark above 10,000 feet is not the sky you see from any road or town. It's the unfiltered version. So many stars so densely packed that the dark space has become the minority, and the Milky Way isn't a stripe, but a presence, a structure. I lay on the granite outside my bivvy for a while, before the cold drove me in. I woke up around midnight needing to urinate, which happens at altitude. The kidneys work differently up there. Something about oxygen compensation and fluid regulation. I unzipped the bivvy, stood up, took care of what needed taking care of, and was lowering myself back onto the sleeping pad when I saw the figure. I want to try to describe what I saw accurately. The basin was lit by a 3/4 moon that had risen while I slept, and the granite surfaces were pale silver in that light, so the visibility was better than you'd expect. Not good, but enough. Across the tarn on the far side of the lake, on the granite slope that rises from the water's edge toward the ridge above, there was something standing. My first thought was boulder. The brain does this, presents the most acceptable explanation first. But boulders do not reconfigure. What I was seeing resolved over the course of about 3 seconds, from irregular dark shape into something bipedal and upright. It was on the slope at an angle, and it was standing the way a person stands. Weight on 2 legs, upright torso, discernible head. The proportions were wrong. I've thought about this a great deal, and I keep coming back to the proportions. A person at 200 yards in moonlight reads a certain way. The ratio of torso to leg length, the size of the head relative to the shoulders, the general silhouette. What I was looking at had limbs that read as slightly too long. Not dramatically, not cartoonishly, slightly. And the head read as slightly too small for the body. These are subtle things. You might dismiss them as the effect of distance and uncertain light. I tried to dismiss them and found I couldn't. It was not moving. I was not moving. The lake between us was absolutely still. And in the still water, the reflection of the stars was perfect and unbroken. And I found myself looking at that reflection rather than at the thing on the slope, and then forcing my eyes back up to the slope, and then looking at the reflection again, which was a kind of deflection my brain was performing without my permission. I have no reliable estimate of how long we were both still. My sense of time was already compromised by altitude and incomplete sleep, and the specific cognitive flatness that comes from cold air and low oxygen at elevation. It could have been 2 minutes, it could have been closer to 10. Then it turned. I've watched people make decisions to leave. There's a particular way the body organizes itself when you decide to go somewhere. A gathering, a reorientation, a shift of weight. What I saw on that slope was exactly that. A slow turn, and then it moved back up the slope toward the ridge. And the speed at which it covered the ground was not right. The slope was steep, and the surface was loose and broken granite, the kind of terrain where a person moves carefully and slowly, testing each foot placement. This moved with an ease that felt completely inappropriate to the terrain. It covered the distance to the ridge in a time that I cannot reconcile with anyone I've ever watched move across high Sierra granite. And then the ridge was just the ridge. I got back into the bivvy and lay on my back and looked at the ceiling of the bivvy sack, which was this dark green nylon, and breathed. My heart rate was elevated but not panicked. It had done what bodies do. Prioritized, clarified, stripped away everything that wasn't relevant to the immediate situation. I breathed until the heart rate came down. Outside, the granite bowl was silent. In the morning, I made coffee and drank it sitting on a rock looking at the far slope. In daylight, it was just granite, steep and pale and empty. I spent about 20 minutes looking at it, and there was nothing to see. I've told this story twice. Once to Theo, who listened carefully and then said, "Are you sure it wasn't another hiker?" I said I was sure, and he nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation, which is exactly the right way to handle it. Once to my brother, who is a physician, who immediately went to altitude-induced visual disturbances and the known effects of hypoxia on perception and cognition. I told him I'd thought about all of that. He said, "And?" I said I'd still thought about all of that. He didn't push further. I want to be honest about the altitude explanation because it deserves more than a dismissal. Hypoxia does affect visual processing. At 11,000 feet without acclimatization time, the brain is running on less oxygen than it's designed for, and it compensates in ways that sometimes introduce errors. I've read about hypnagogic hallucinations at elevation, the visual experiences that occur in the transition between sleep and waking, which I'd been in the middle of when I woke to urinate. I've read about the way the dark adapted eye, in low light conditions, sometimes generates false movement at the periphery from nothing more than the firing of fatigued photoreceptors. I've sat with all of this. Here's what I keep running into. The hallucinations and visual errors documented at altitude are typically diffuse, poorly defined, and occur at the edges of vision. What I saw was in the center of my field of view. It was defined. It had specific proportions. It moved with a specificity, a purposefulness, a relation to the terrain it moved across that does not match what I know about hypnagogic hallucination. Hallucinations don't navigate terrain. They don't move with the particular micro-adjustments of something placing its feet on real ground. This did. Every movement of it read as real. There's also the matter of what it did before it left. That slow turn, that gathering of intention before moving. The way it seemed to have made a decision. I've been awake at altitude many times, and I've had the edge case experiences that elevation produces in the brain, and none of them have ever felt like something else making a decision. I've been back to Kings Canyon twice since. I stay in the lower elevations now, below 10,000, which has nothing to do with the altitude and everything to do with the fact that the Gardener Basin is not a place I want to be in the dark anymore. I'm honest enough to admit that. There is something I've never told Theo or my brother, something I noticed in the morning before I packed up and started the hike out. I went down to the water's edge of the tarn on the opposite side from my camp, working my way around, and I looked at the far slope, the slope where I'd seen it, from below. It was steep and the rock was loose and fractured, the kind of the granite that has been through repeated freeze-thaw cycles until its surface is unconsolidated. Moving on it quietly would be essentially impossible. Every step on loose granite makes a sound, the clatter of small stones, the shift of fractured plates. I'd heard nothing from that slope while I watched the figure move up it. Not a sound. Nothing at all but the wind. There's something in those high places that the emptiness and the thinness of the air has stripped of ordinary rules. I don't know what it is. I know what it looked like from 200 yards in moonlight, and I know what it felt like to watch it decide to leave. And I know that it moved across that granite ridge with the ease of something that belonged there in a way I never will. Story 3. The third day of a transect is usually the day I find my rhythm. The first day you're still shaking off the drive and the logistics. The second day you're tired in a deep way that comes from sleeping on the ground and using muscles you don't use in ordinary life. But the third day, your body has capitulated and accepted what you're asking of it. And the work becomes what it's supposed to be, which is walking and watching and recording. I was contracted through my consulting firm to do elk population density sampling along a ridgeline south of the Coffee Creek drainage in the Shasta Trinity. This is not country that gets a lot of visitors. The roads into that section of the wilderness are rough, and the trails thin out quickly, and the understory is the kind of dense mixed conifer that doesn't reward casual hiking. I've been doing this work for 14 years for state agencies and federal agencies and private conservation groups, and I've spent weeks at a time in every kind of California backcountry. I'm not easily unsettled by things I encounter in the field. I want to establish that clearly. I'd set up my tent camp at the confluence of two small creek drainages at roughly 5,000 feet in a bowl that got afternoon sun and caught morning shade from the ridge to the east. Good camp, clean water from both directions, flat ground, far enough from the water that I wasn't mosquito battered. I'd been out there since Monday. It It was Tuesday, or I believe it was Tuesday. I sometimes lose track of days on a long transect, which is both a feature and a bug of the work. The morning transect starts at first light. You walk a predetermined line at a slow and deliberate pace, recording every sign of elk presence. Tracks, scat, rubs, wallows, direct sightings in a waterproof field tablet. You move slowly enough to see things, but consistently enough to cover the distance. It is repetitive in the way that is pleasurable, the way that walking a familiar route with purpose is pleasurable. The Trinity Forest in the morning has a quality of light that comes through the mixed conifers and shafts, the dust and spores in the air catching it and making it visible as a thing with dimension. I love this work in the morning. I was about a mile from camp, the ridge to the north, the drainage falling away to the south below me, when I came around a bend in the game trail I'd been following and stopped. A coyote was standing in the middle of the trail, approximately 100 yards ahead, facing me. This is not remarkable. Coyotes are curious. They'll stand in a trail and assess you and decide you're uninteresting and move off into the brush. I've had them follow me at a distance for a quarter mile, just watching, the way curious animals watch. I stopped and watched it, and it watched me. This is normal protocol, both biologically and from a practical standpoint. Then it sat down. Not a quick drop into a resting crouch, a deliberate slow sit, the way a dog sits when it's been told to. Hindquarters down, front legs straight, body upright. And it held that position and looked at me. That was slightly unusual. Interesting, even. A sitting coyote in the middle of a trail was not something I'd documented before. I made a note in my tablet. Behavioral anomaly, coyote, class 1, investigate. And kept watching. The coyote tilted its head. I've seen dogs tilt their heads at unfamiliar sounds. The quick rotation of curiosity. This was not that. This was slow, deliberate. The head rotated in what I can only describe as a considered motion, degree by degree, until the skull was nearly horizontal, canted almost fully sideways and held there, and held there, and held there. I raised my binoculars. I have a good pair, the kind you use in serious field work, and from 100 yards with a clear line of sight, they put you very close to whatever you're looking at. And what I was looking at through those lenses was wrong. The wrongness was not dramatic. It was specific and quiet and very hard to articulate, which is the most unsettling kind of wrong. The eyes were too wide and the placement of them was too forward. Coyote eyes are lateral, positioned on the sides of the skull for wide-angle peripheral vision, the way prey animals are configured. The eyes I was looking at through those binoculars were placed more centrally, more like a human face or a primate face than a coyote face, and the ears were not moving. Coyote ears are constantly in motion, tracking sound the way a radar dish tracks a signal. They move in small, constant adjustments, always working. These ears were completely still, not held flat, which is a communication posture, just still, as if the mechanism for their movement had been switched off. I lowered the binoculars. The coyote was still sitting in the trail 100 yards away. I raised them again. The face had reoriented. The head was now upright again, but the face was directed squarely at me with the kind of directness that felt different from normal animal attention. Coyote attention is intelligent and calculating. They are intelligent animals with calculating eyes, but there is a wildness in it, an alien quality that you can always feel when an animal looks at you. This did not feel wild. It felt purposeful in a different way, patient in a way I didn't like. I lowered the binoculars and took a step backward. The coyote stood up and took a step forward. Protocol for large predators. Make yourself large, make noise, do not run. I threw my arms out wide and shouted, not words, just sound loud and sudden, the kind of noise that startles every animal I've ever encountered. The coyote stopped. It looked at me for another moment, then it sat back down. I kept backing up, facing it, and it sat and watched me go. When the bend of the trail put a stand of fir between us, I turned and walked at a pace that was not quite running, but would have looked strange to anyone watching. I did not hear it follow me. Back at camp, I sat into my camp chair and wrote 3 pages of field notes. My handwriting is usually small and precise, and it was neither that morning. The entry includes the phrase, abnormal ocular presentation, and absence of pinnae mobility. And at the very end, written after I had been sitting for a while, with my mug of cold coffee and thinking about what I had seen and how to categorize it, one additional line, not illness, something else. I've turned that line over in my mind many times. I wrote it because I was trying to be precise and because in the field, precision matters. I stand behind the observation and I will not walk it back for the sake of seeming rational. Whatever was in that coyote was not a disease. I know what disease looks like in the field, and this was not it. The coat was thick and clean, the movement was unimpeded. The animal was physically healthy by every external measure I know how to apply. What was in it was not something I have a name for. That is an unsatisfying place to end up, for someone who has spent 14 years naming things. But it's where I am. If something in Luce's story is sitting with you, and you want to think out loud about it, that's what the comments section is for. Leave what you're thinking down below. And if you've been listening to this channel for a while, and you haven't yet joined the membership, I want to tell you what's over there. Members get early access to every episode before it goes public. They get extended cuts of stories, where the narrator sent in more than I was able to include in the main video. And they get exclusive member-only narrations that I record specifically for that community and that never go out to the general channel. The link is in the description, and I would genuinely love to see you over there. Now let's keep going. Story 4. I taught American history at the same high school in San Diego for 30 years. That job teaches you a great deal about attention spans, which is to say, it teaches you how to maintain your own when the environment is working against you. I know the difference between what happened and what we say happened. I know how memory gets shaped by the need for narrative, how eyewitness accounts shift over time toward coherence, how the human brain has a very strong preference for explanations that are tidy. I know all of that, and I've tried to apply it honestly to what I experienced in the Borogo Badlands. I retired in May of the year I turned 52 and spent 3 months doing nothing before deciding I needed to stop doing nothing before it became permanent. Anza Borogo was on a list I'd been keeping for years, one of those running lists that people keep in their heads of places they intend to go when they have the time, and which they rarely actually go to because the time never feels quite arrived. The spring bloom had been extraordinary that year. Every news outlet in Southern California had run the pictures, and the desert floor gone orange and purple in ways it does only once in a decade. And I wanted to see what it looked like without 1,000 other cars in the parking lots. I went in March, which everyone said was the right time. I was not an experienced backpacker. I want to establish that early and honestly. I'd done day hikes. I had done one overnight at a state park campground with a car parked 15 feet from my tent. This was different. I'd bought proper gear, done real research, talked to a ranger at the visitor center who was patient and specific with me. I went in on the Palm Canyon Trail, camped the first night at a developed site near the trail, and on the second day, I pushed further east into the Badlands section, following a used trail described in an older desert guide I'd found in a used bookstore in Normal Heights. The Badlands of Anza Borogo are a specific kind of landscape that doesn't prepare you properly, no matter how many photographs you look at ahead of time. The clay formations are layered in colors: ochre, rust, pale gray. And they've been eroded by water into shapes that are organic and strange. Smooth curves and sharp ridges and narrow slot passages between walls that rise 15 feet on either side of you. The scale is difficult to read from a distance. Objects that appear small at a distance turn out to be huge and the other way around. Your spatial intuition, calibrated for normal landscapes, keeps misfiring. I made camp in the late afternoon on a flat area between two larger formations, sheltered from the wind and with a view east toward the Salton Sea, which was a pale shimmer on the horizon, and beyond it the mountains going blue and then purple as the sun set. I ate from a can. I was not a cook on this trip, just a person with a can opener, and drank the lukewarm water from my insulated bottle and watched the desert go dark. The desert at night has what I've heard called a false silence, and now that I've spent a night in it, I understand what that means. It looks like silence from a distance. It reads as silent from a highway, but when you are inside it, the sounds accumulate. The tick of cooling clay, the movements of small mammals you never see, the wind that moves in short, concentrated pulses and then stops completely, the insects that don't stop. I lay in my tent with the side panel unzipped and listened to all of it and found it not unpleasant, just startling after a lifetime of city sleep. I was awake past midnight. The moon was very nearly full and the Badlands around my camp were silver and gray in that light. The shadows in the clay formations black and perfectly defined, the kind of shadows that have edges. I was thinking about nothing much, the particular comfortable emptiness that comes when you've been physically tired enough to stop thinking. Then the sound came from the southwest. It was low, below speech, below music, below most of what we call sound in ordinary life. It was in the register that you feel rather than hear, the frequency that lives in the chest cavity, in the sternum. My dog at home does a warning rumble sometimes in that register when something is outside the front door, and this had the same quality, deep and deliberate and sustained. It came from the direction of a large clay formation I'd been using as a landmark all day, a pale dome maybe 300 yards to my southwest. Then there were lights above the formation. Red. Deep, saturated red, not the red of a flare or a tail light or any light I have a category for. 3 of them in a loose and irregular triangular arrangement, hovering at what I judged to be approximately 200 feet above the top of the dome. They were not blinking, they were not moving. They were simply present, very still, and very red. I sat up in my sleeping bag and looked at them. I should say that I am not a credulous person. 30 years of teaching American history means 30 years of evidence-based thinking, of teaching students to distinguish between primary sources and secondary sources, between eyewitness accounts and interpretation, between what can be supported and what cannot. I looked at those lights and I went through my mental inventory of what they might be. Aircraft. The arrangement was wrong. The coloring was wrong. There was no navigation light white, no blinking interval. Drone. In 2019, drones of the kind available to civilians did not have that arrangement, that color, that size. I'm aware technology advances, and I've looked at what was available then, and none of it matches. Atmospheric phenomenon. I'm not a meteorologist, but I've never seen an atmospheric phenomenon that was red, stable, and geometrically arranged. The lights held their position for approximately 3 minutes. I counted. I'm a person who counts things when he wants to be precise. Then the leftmost one dropped. Not fell. Dropped, as in moved downward with controlled speed. The other 2 followed in sequence. The second about a second after the first, the third about a second after the second. Not falling, but descending in a cascade. Too controlled and too intentional for any natural movement. And then the sound stopped and they were gone. I sat in the dark and felt my heartbeat. The desert went back to its accumulation of small sounds. The moon moved slightly. I was very aware of my own breathing. In the morning, I walked to the formation. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. The ground around the base was pale clay, completely undisturbed, the light crust of the desert surface intact. I stood there for a while and felt slightly foolish, which is a useful feeling because it keeps you honest about what you can and cannot claim. I drove back to San Diego that afternoon and sat at my kitchen table that evening and wrote a detailed account of what I'd seen with timestamps and descriptions, as precise as I could make them. The note runs 3 pages. I've read it several times since, and I've also showed it to 2 people. One, a retired Air Force officer I know from the neighborhood, and one, a colleague from teaching who now works in environmental science. The Air Force officer read it twice, handed it back, and said he hadn't seen anything like what I was describing in his years of service. And he'd seen a lot of aircraft do a lot of things at night. The environmental scientist asked if I had a photograph, which I didn't, and then asked if I'd been using any prescription medication that could affect visual perception. I wasn't, and I told her so. And she said she believed me and didn't say anything else. There's a line at the very bottom of my 3-page account, written after I'd finished the main body, that I added without a clear memory of deciding to add it. The handwriting is slightly different from the rest, looser, faster, like the words came out before I could slow them down. It says, "They knew where I was." I don't know why I wrote that. I've thought about why I wrote that for years. I had no specific evidence that what I saw was aware of my presence. The lights did not move toward me. They did not change their behavior after I sat up, as far as I could observe. Nothing in the visual record I kept, nothing in the logic of the event as I experienced it explains that line. But I believe it. I believed it when I wrote it, and I believe it now. Sitting in the same kitchen where I wrote it 5 years later, drinking the same kind of coffee I was drinking when I wrote it. Something was above that clay formation in the dark Borrego Badlands on a March night, and it knew exactly where I was. I don't know what that means, and I know that history is full of things that were true before they were named. And I know that the desert at night is older than any explanation I could offer for it. I've been back to Anza Borrego twice since. Day trips, not overnight. I always stay east of the visitor center, in the developed areas, near other people. I tell myself it's because the bloom isn't worth the rough roads. It isn't the roads. Story 5. From Simone Archambault, 27. Point Reyes National Seashore, Tamales Point, Marin County. The wind at Tamales Point doesn't observe rules. It comes from the northwest off the Pacific, and it comes from the east off Tamales Bay, and somehow it manages to come from both directions at the same time, in a way that doesn't resolve into something consistent, just a constant shifting pressure from wherever you're not facing. I surf, so I know wind. I spent 3 years as a surf instructor in Pacifica, and I've developed an understanding of how wind behaves on coastlines, how it reads the terrain and moves in predictable patterns. Tamales Point defeats this understanding entirely. The wind out there does what it wants. I'd driven up from Pacifica on a Saturday in January, because January is the off-season at Point Reyes, and the elk are active in winter, and I'd been meaning to photograph them for a year, and kept finding reasons not to go. I have a decent camera, not professional equipment, but good enough. I parked at the Pierce Point Ranch trailhead in the dark at 6 in the morning, and was on the trail just as the sky went from black to the particular deep gray of pre-dawn, when shapes become visible without having colors yet. The Tule elk were out early, a herd of maybe 30 or 40 animals, moving through the brown winter grass on the western side of the ridge. I got good images. The light was doing what winter light does in Marin, low and golden and horizontal, and the elk moved through it like they'd been arranged for a photograph. I was happy in the specific way that being in exactly the right place at the right time makes you happy. The feeling that you made the right decision and the world is acknowledging it. I hiked all the way to the northern tip of the point, where the trail ends at a rocky bluff above the water. The Pacific going gray-green in all directions, pelicans working the updrafts along the cliff edge, the Farallon Islands, a dark suggestion on the horizon to the west. I sat on a flat rock and ate the sandwich I'd packed and took more photographs, and did not think about much of anything for about 40 minutes. It was a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I'd called out sick from a Tuesday shift to do this, a thing I'd felt mildly guilty about, and that I now feel entirely justified about. The trail had been empty since the first mile, not a person in either direction as far as I could see, which is one of the underrated gifts of the January off-season in a national seashore. I started back south around 10:30. The wind had shifted and was now coming from the west in longer, steadier gusts that bent the coastal scrub on the eastern slope and put a sound in the grass like something moving through it. I'd gone about a mile when I noticed the man. He was standing off the trail to the east, in the low coastal scrub that covers the slope descending toward Tamales Bay, about 40 yards off the trail. He was wearing dark clothing, a dark jacket, and what appeared to be dark pants, and he was standing completely upright with his hands at his sides and his face oriented toward the bay. Not walking, not sitting, standing. I slowed and looked at him. He was not looking at me. He was just there in the scrub, facing the water. People stand in odd places in national parks for reasons that are usually benign, looking for something, taking a private moment, watching birds. I noted him and kept walking. 20 yards past him, I glanced back. He had not moved, facing the bay, hands at his sides. Okay, people stand still. People stand very still and look at water for extended periods, especially in places this beautiful. I faced forward and kept my pace. About a quarter mile further, I stopped at the top of a small rise to look south along the trail and figure out approximately how far I'd come. The ridge behind me was empty, no one on the trail, no one visible in the scrub. He was gone, which was completely normal and fine. I turned south and kept walking. Then footsteps behind me. I turned. He was on the trail, maybe 60 yards back, walking toward me. The pace was fast. Not running, but decisively faster than a casual hike. The kind of pace that closes distance. He was too far for me to see his face clearly, but the shape of him was the same as before. Dark jacket, upright posture, hands now moving at his sides with the walk. I turned and kept walking. My own pace picked up. Not a run, just faster. I am a physically confident person. Surfing keeps you strong and balanced. And I made a deliberate decision not to run because running signals something. I kept my pace fast and steady and didn't look back for 3 full minutes. When I looked back, the trail was empty. I stopped, turned completely around. The trail ran straight and visible for 200 yards in both directions in this section, and there was no one on it in either direction. The scrub on both sides was low enough that a standing person would be visible above it. There was nothing. I kept going. The wind was doing its several directions thing, and it filled the coastal scrub with constant soft rustling, and I found it very hard to distinguish between wind sounds and other sounds in that context, which was frustrating. I stopped twice and stood very still and listened and heard only wind. 2 miles from the trailhead, the trail passes through a shallow draw between 2 small hills before emerging onto the final open stretch. The draw is narrow, and the scrub on both sides is dense, taller than my head, and it muffles sound in a way the rest of the trail doesn't. I was walking through this draw when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around very fast. The draw was empty. The trail curved behind me, and I could see perhaps 40 yards back before it bent out of sight. Nothing on the visible stretch. The scrub on both sides rustling in the wind. I turned around and walked out of the draw fast and did not slow my pace until I was in the parking lot and could see the other cars and my own car among them. Then I stopped and stood in the lot for a moment and breathed. There were several other cars there by now, mid-morning, having drawn a few more visitors. I sat in my car and watched the trailhead for a few minutes. I don't know what I expected. Nobody came out of the trail. I drove south on Point Reyes Petaluma Road with the heater on high, even though I wasn't cold, just wanting the sound of something familiar. The man standing in the scrub with his hands at his side, facing the bay, not moving. I want to address the most available explanation, which is that he was a hiker who happened to be walking in the same direction, and the feeling of being followed was the ordinary anxiety of a woman alone on a quiet trail, her perception shaped by the story that anxiety tells. I've held this explanation up carefully. I've tried to make it account for all the specifics. Here's where it fails. The draw. In that shallow cut between the two hills 2 miles from the trailhead, I heard footsteps on the trail behind me. I turned and the trail was empty for 40 visible yards. The scrub on both sides of the draw is dense and head-high and made of the kind of coastal brush, coyote brush and coffeeberry and sticky monkey flower. That snaps and displaces loudly when you push through it. If someone stepped off that trail into that scrub, I would have heard it. There was no sound. The scrub was still. The footsteps had been on the trail, and then nothing had moved off the trail. And yet, nothing was on the trail. I have no mechanical explanation for that. The stillness also. The specific quality of the stillness of the man in the scrub on the eastern slope. Not the stillness of someone who has just paused to look at something, which has a readiness in it. A coiled quality of someone who will move again soon. The stillness I saw was different. It was the stillness of something that had been in place for a long time and had no plans to move. That was simply present. That was waiting. I've tried to explain that quality away and found I can't, because stillness of that kind is itself abnormal in a person. People shift, people fidget, people adjust. This did not. I've been back to Point Reyes 4 times since. I always take the Bear Valley Trails or the Lemon Tour area. I tell people it's because the mudflat birds are better there in winter, which is true. The mudflats are extraordinary. Godwits and dowitchers, and the occasional rare Asian vagrant that makes birders drive from Sacramento. But the real reason is that Tomales Point has a quality in my memory now that I can't explain away. A quality tied specifically to the stillness of that man and the way his stillness read, not as peaceful, but as patient. Like he was waiting for something. Like he had been waiting for a long time and was prepared to keep waiting indefinitely. I don't know what he was waiting for. I am glad I didn't stay to find out. Story 6. There's a kind of quiet that climbing produces in the mind that I've never found anywhere else. Technical problems requiring complete attention, every move deliberate and committed, your body and brain running on the same program for the duration. I've been doing it since 19 and I've climbed in a lot of places. Pinnacles is one of my regulars, particularly in the late fall and winter, when the central coastline goes low and golden, and the rhyolite columns glow a color close to orange in the afternoon. I've been there probably 25 times. Bear Gulch Cave is a talus cave, which means it formed not from water dissolving limestone, the usual cave-making process, but from enormous boulders falling and stacking against each other, leaving hollow chambers and passages between them. It's extensive, longer, and more complex than it looks from outside, with chambers that open into other chambers and passages that narrow and then widen and require different postures to navigate. The Park Service closes sections of it seasonally to protect the bat colonies that roost inside. California myotis and Townsend's big-eared bats. Thousands of them in the deep chambers. I'd come down in February for a solo trip, planning to spend 2 days on the High Peak Circuit and the balconies area. The cave was in its winter closure. I wasn't planning to go in. I was descending the Bear Gulch Trail in the late afternoon, maybe 3:30, moving through the section where the trail follows the creek between steep boulder fields. The light at that hour in February is coming from a low angle through the canyon walls, and it makes everything in the gulch amber and high contrast, the shadows long and very dark. The air was cold down in the canyon, colder than on the exposed ridgeline and wet from the creek. The lower cave entrance is a gap between two very large boulders at trail level, maybe 5 feet tall, 2 feet wide. A metal gate was installed across it, locked with a padlock, as it is during closure. I stopped there to drink from my water bottle and rest my shoulders for a minute. I've looked into that gate before, on previous visits. The passage inside drops at a shallow angle and curves, and your light doesn't penetrate far. On a whim, or what felt like a whim, I leaned close to the bars and turned on my headlamp and shined it inside. Cold air came out immediately, the kind of cold that lives deep in stone, wet and mineral and very still. I could smell the guano and the particular damp rock smell of caves. The light picked out the first 15 feet of passage, the walls wet and dark, the floor uneven granite, and then the curve took it out of sight. From somewhere beyond the curve, something made a sound. I'm going to try to describe this accurately because accuracy matters here. It was low. Lower than any sound I normally categorize as a sound. It was in a frequency that you feel as a physical sensation before you process it with your ears, specifically in the chest, specifically in the sternum, specifically at the center of it. A resonant, sustained, deliberate vibration. I thought immediately of a warning, not because the sound had a shape that said warning, but because every system in my body read it as such. The way the body knows things before the brain catches up. I stepped back from the gate. The sound stopped. I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, sorting through options. A bat colony in a disturbed state makes sounds, but I know bat sounds. They're high and chittery and rapid. Water moving through stone makes sounds, but water sounds are chaotic. They follow the random logic of fluid dynamics. This was none of those things. It was single, sustained, and had the quality of intention. I stepped close to the gate again and shined the light in. The sound started again. Same frequency, same quality, same deliberate and sustained character. And this time, I was fairly certain it was coming from deeper in the cave. Not from the first passage, but from beyond the curve, from whatever chambers lay further in. I moved back. It stopped. I stood at the gate for a long moment and ran through what I was dealing with. The afternoon light in the gulch had shifted, the shadows longer now, the amber deepening toward a flat reddish orange that comes in the last hour before the canyon walls block the direct sun completely. The creek ran over its rocks behind me, a constant and ordinary sound that was somehow steadying in the way that ordinary sounds are steadying when you have recently been in contact with something that isn't ordinary. I've done thorough research since. I've read everything available. This is about the Pinnacle's cave fauna, the geological character of the talus formation, the acoustic properties of cavities formed from stacked irregular boulders. The most frequently documented large animal known to use those cavities is the mountain lion. And I've talked to 2 different rangers at Pinnacles about sounds produced by big cats in enclosed rocky spaces. Both described mountain lion vocalizations as unmistakable. Loud, prolonged, the specific kind of caterwauling. It sounds like a person in serious distress. Both said you would have no doubt what you were hearing. One ranger pulled up a recording on his phone to demonstrate. The sound on that recording bore no resemblance to what I heard in any category. Not volume, not frequency, not quality of tone. What I heard was subtle. What I heard occupied a register that made you question whether you were processing it through your ears at all, or whether your chest cavity and sternum were receiving it in some way that bypassed the normal auditory pathway. I've looked into infrasound very low frequency sound below 20 hertz, which is documented in certain cave systems and which is known to produce a range of effects in humans, including unease, disorientation, and the perception of presence. I can't rule this out. What I can say is that the sound I heard responded to my movements, stopping when I stepped back, resuming when I stepped forward, in a way that infrasound produced by passive air movement, doesn't do. What I heard was a statement, not a sound exactly, though it was a sound. A statement, a communication. The content of the communication was not ambiguous. You are at the edge of what I allow. Do not come further. I picked up my pack and continued down the trail. I cooked dinner that night at the campground, talked to 2 other climbers at the neighboring site about conditions on the high peaks, went to bed at a reasonable hour. I slept fine. But the following morning, I packed my gear and drove back to the Bay Area a day early. I told people my shoulder was giving me trouble, which was not true. My shoulder was fine. It was something else that wasn't fine, something that didn't have a name I was comfortable using, something I'd left in the Bear Gulch Canyon at 3:30 in the February afternoon when I stood at that gate and heard what I heard and understood with absolute clarity that I should not come back to it. I kept my gear in storage for 6 months after that. I told everyone it was the shoulder. Story 7. I want to say something about what I do with things I can't explain. I spent 30 years as a family nurse practitioner, which means 30 years of making decisions about what is real and what isn't, what symptoms indicate something and what they indicate nothing, when a patient's experience of their own body is data and when it's noise. That kind of work trains you to be honest about the limits of knowledge, to be precise about what you observed versus what you inferred, and to be suspicious of easy explanations in both directions. Both the explanation that says, it's nothing, when something is wrong, and the explanation that says, it's something, when there's insufficient evidence. I retired in my early 60s and kept walking because I've been walking since my daughters were small, when I'd take them out on the Marin trails on weekends. Mount Tamalpais is not a place I'm exploring, it's a place I know. I know the switchbacks on the mountain's north face and where the trail goes muddy in the rain, and which sections of the Dipsy have been rerouted since I started walking it 2 decades ago. I know that trail. September of 2017, a Tuesday morning, clear sky, the particular quality of September light in Marin, which is different from summer light and different from fall light, still warm but with an edge. The shadows slightly longer than you expect. I started the Dipsy heading south towards Stinson with the plan to connect to the Matt Davis and loop back, a full day walk I'd done several times. I had lunch in my pack, good boots, sunscreen, water. I'd told my husband where I was going and approximately when I'd be back, which is the simple safety practice I've maintained my whole walking life. The first section of the Dipsy goes through the neighborhoods of Mill Valley before climbing into the redwoods. And I always like the transition, the way the trail goes from residential streets to towering trees in the space of a quarter mile, like the forest is a room you step into. Once you're in the redwoods, everything changes. The sound changes. The light changes. Even the smell changes, that particular dark earth and wet wood smell of old-growth coast redwood that I associate specifically with this trail. Redwood forest dark is different from other kinds of forest dark. The canopy goes up 200 feet and more and blocks out the sky completely. So even on a bright September day, you are walking in a kind of perpetual dusk. The light filtered through so many layers of needles and bark that it comes out flattened and gray-green. Sound is absorbed rather than reflected. The trunks and needles and the deep duff of the forest floor act as the acoustic damper, so that your footsteps sound muffled and your voice, if you spoke, would not carry far. People tend to speak more quietly in redwood groves without knowing why. It's a physical response to a physical environment. I was about 1.5 miles in when I saw it. A figure. Off the trail to the left, in the dark space between 2 very large redwood trunks, maybe 30 feet from the path. Standing upright, very tall, though calibrating exact height in a forest of trees that large is difficult. Wearing something dark, a jacket or a coat. Facing away from me, or mostly away. I could not see a face, either because the figure was turned away, or because the darkness between the trunks was too deep for facial detail at that distance. The thing that registered first, before anything else, was the stillness. Not the stillness of someone who has stopped walking and is looking at something. That kind of stillness has a loose quality to it, a readiness for motion. This was different. This was the stillness of something that had been standing in exactly that position for a long time, like a post, like a marker, like it had grown there. I'm a medical professional. My default response to someone standing in an unexpected location in the woods is concern, not fear. I stopped and said at full conversational volume, "Good morning," loudly enough to be heard at 30 feet without difficulty. No response. I said, "Are you all right?" Which is a question I've asked many times in many contexts, and which I know how to read the response to. No response. I took one step off the trail toward it. The space between the two trunks was empty. Not empty because something had run. Not empty because I'd misjudged the direction and the figure was actually somewhere else. Empty the way a space becomes empty when it was occupied and then isn't, except that the transition from occupied to empty happened in the interval between one blink and the next, with no movement visible, with no sound, with nothing that corresponded to a physical body, relocating from one place to another. I stood at the edge of the trail for a full minute. I'm using the word full intentionally. A full 60 seconds, counted roughly, looking at the space between those trees. The duff of the forest floor was undisturbed. The shadows were the same. The dark space between the trunks was just dark space between large trunks, nothing in it, nothing having been in it as far as I could see. I went back to the trail and kept walking. I finished the Dipsy. I connected to the Matt Davis and looped back the long way. I ate my lunch on an exposed section of trail with a view west toward the ocean and the marine layer coming in off the Pacific. And I thought about what I'd seen and tried with the analytical habits of 30 years to find the explanation that made sense. The most available explanation? I misidentified a redwood trunk as a human figure in the transition from trail light to redwood dark. Eyes take time to adjust to dramatic changes in light level, and in that adjustment period, the brain interpolates, fills in, sees shapes that match its expectations. I've looked at this explanation carefully. I've been back to that section of trail specifically to look at the trunks and assess whether any of them could, at 30 feet in that light, resolve into a convincing human shape. None of them do. They are very large, dark, and clearly cylindrical. They do not read as people. The second explanation? Another hiker, standing very still, who moved behind a trunk so quickly that I failed to register the motion. I've thought about this too. The space between the trunks where the figure stood was approximately 6 feet wide and open on all visible sides. Moving out of that space in any direction would have required crossing visible ground. I don't know how to make this explanation work with what I observed. There are traditions in California's indigenous cultures about presences in old-growth forest. I won't claim those frameworks as mine, but I'll say that whatever was in that dark space between those trees felt purposeful. Not threatening, not aggressive, but purposeful. Aware. Present in a way that the trees themselves were not present, in a way that suggested intention. The other thing I've turned over is the transition itself, the instantaneous quality of the disappearance. I've seen people move quickly in low light. I understand that the eye can miss motion under the right conditions, that a fast enough movement into cover can register as absence rather than movement. I've tried to apply this to what I saw. Here's the problem. The space between those two trunks was open on all visible sides. To move from that space into cover fast enough to appear to vanish would require moving in a direction that should have been visible to me, crossing ground I was looking at. I can't reconcile what I saw with any version of that. I've also looked at those trunks specifically on 2 subsequent visits to the Dipsy to assess whether any of them could have generated a convincing human silhouette at 30 feet in the transition light between the trail and the forest interior. I've stood at the edge of the trail and looked at every trunk in that section. None of them resolve into a human form, not even close. They are very large, clearly cylindrical, clearly not human-shaped. This is not a case of the brain making a man out of a tree. I've walked the Dipsy many times since. I go early, I bring good boots. I walk the whole thing and appreciate every mile of it. I've never seen the figure again. I'm genuinely uncertain how I feel about that. Part of me, the nurse, the person who spent 30 years practicing precision, would like the chance to look again, more carefully, to apply everything I know about observation to what I'm observing. The other part of me is quietly grateful that the space between those trees has stayed empty on every subsequent walkthrough. Before we get into the final 2 stories, and I want you to stay for both of them, because they are the 2 that affected me most. If this is your first time here, and you've made it this far, go ahead and like this video right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the algorithm shows this to more people, which means more stories make their way in, which means better episodes for everyone. I appreciate it more than you know. Now, 2 more. Neither one ends neatly. You have been warned. Story 8. I'm Garrett Fontaine. I've been foraging since I was old enough to follow my mother through the fields outside the village where she grew up, outside Lyon in eastern France. She knew plants the way some people know music, intuitively and in her body, and she taught me to look at the ground rather than through it. When I came back to California in my late 20s after time in France and Spain, the coastal ranges were a revelation. The chaparral and mixed oak woodland of Los Padres National Forest is extraordinary habitat if you know what to look for. I've been foraging in there for 15 years, and I can feed myself for days from what I carry in my eyes. The Sespe Wilderness, specifically the country around Wheeler Gorge and the upper Sespe Creek drainage, is where I spend most of my time. It's remote by Ventura County standards. The roads in are rough, and the trails thin out quickly into game routes and old fire breaks that most hikers don't follow. The further in you go, the fewer people you encounter, and the less disturbed the foraging zones are. I have spots in there that I've never told anyone about. A stand of black chanterelles in a drainage north of the Sespe, a hillside of nettles that comes up dense and reliable every February after the first heavy rain, a section of oak woodland with mycorrhizal conditions I've never seen replicated anywhere else. It was March, a Tuesday, not a holiday or a weekend, so the parking area at the Wheeler Gorge campground would be empty or close to it. I'd driven down from Ojai the night before, camped at the campground, woken before dawn and started in on the trail while the sky was still dark, wanting to reach the drainage before the mid-morning sun made the mushrooms harder to spot. I had my basket, my small knife, my water, a lunch I'd packed in Ojai. I know that trail well enough to walk it in the dark by feel. The morning was good, cool and clear, with the chaparral still holding the night's moisture so that the smell was green and sharp, sage and yerba santa and the dark earth smell that signals fungal activity. I left the main trail at the usual point and climbed north up the drainage, which is steep and narrow and requires using hands on the upper section. And by the time I reached the flat of mixed oak, I was warm and working in the careful mode that foraging requires, full attention on the ground in front of me. The chanterelles were there, a good flush of them, the dark gills catching the slanted morning light that came through the oaks at a low angle. I worked slowly, systematically, covering the flat and overlapping passes the way you'd search for something lost. And I was maybe an hour into it, basket maybe half filled, deeply content in the way that only productive time in a productive wild place produces. Something moved on the slope above me. The upper edge of the flat meets a steep section of chaparral before the ridgeline, all manzanita and scrub oak and chamise. I looked up without much urgency. Deer use that slope, and the sounds of deer and chaparral are familiar. A particular combination of cracking branch and displaced stone. What I heard was heavier than deer. The impact per step was greater, and the cadence was different. I looked at the tree line at the top of the flat and saw something moving through the upper scrub. It was bipedal, upright, moving through the dense manzanita at a walk, and it wasn't stopping for the manzanita. Manzanite is dense and dry and branched in ways that catch everything, and a person moving through it at any speed will pause every several steps to unhook themselves. This did not pause. It moved through continuously, at a steady walk, the branches displacing and resettling as it passed without slowing its progress. It was tall. Even accounting for the uphill angle and the fact that I was below it, it was clearing the lower oak branches by at least a foot, perhaps more. It was moving east along the upper tree line, and it hadn't looked in my direction. I went very still, the automatic stillness that a body makes when it isn't sure what it's dealing with and defaulting to the first option, which is not moving. I watched it for 20 seconds. Then it stopped. The head turned. Slowly, the way a head turns when it has heard something and is orienting toward the source of the sound. It turned downhill, turned toward the flat where I was standing with my basket. And though from 80 yards I couldn't see a face in the broken light through the scrub, the orientation of the head was unmistakably toward me. There was a moment of complete stillness. The chaparral, the oak, the slope, everything holding. Then it made a sound. I've spent a great deal of time trying to describe this sound accurately. Low, rhythmic, structured, not an animal sound that I have a category for, not a bird, not any mammal sound in my experience. It had a syllabic quality. The rhythm of repeated units, the way a word said several times creates a rhythm. But the units did not correspond to any syllable in any language I know. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then it was quiet. Then it moved toward me. Not a charge, not a fast movement. A walk, downhill directly toward the flat. I could see it through the scrub, the size of it, the uprightness of it, moving at a pace that was deliberate rather than urgent, closing the distance with a confidence that conveyed that it was not concerned about what it was walking toward. I picked up my basket and I walked out of the flat. I used the word walk deliberately. I did not run because the terrain would have made running a fast route to a twisted ankle, and I have enough field sense to know that. But the walk I did out of that flat and down the drainage toward the river trail was the fastest controlled walk I've made in 15 years of working rough terrain in Los Padres. I moved with complete attention on where I was putting my feet and with one ear behind me. I heard it in the scrub for a while. Not footsteps exactly. The sound of something moving through chaparral, branches giving and resettling at an irregular rhythm. Sometimes it seemed close, 15 yards or less, sometimes further back. And then maybe 10 minutes into my exit, it stopped. I reached the river trail and did not slow my pace for the 3 miles back to the campground. I put my basket in the back of my truck, basket still half full of chanterelles, and sat in the driver's seat with the door locked and my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. I sat there for 4 or 5 minutes. Then I started it and drove out. I made pasta with the chanterelles that night at my apartment in Ojai, and it was good. Black chanterelles and butter and a little white wine and pasta water, simple. I ate the whole pan. I didn't think about the Sespe during dinner, which was either a healthy dissociation or just hunger catching up with me, and I'm not sure which. I have 2 other spots in Los Padres. I use those now. I find good things in both of them. I haven't been back to the drainage north of the Sespe, and I don't have plans to go back. The chanterelles will do well without me. That flat, that drainage, that slope, they belonged to whatever was moving through the upper scrub on that March morning, and it made clear in its way that it knew that. Story 9. I should tell you about the knife first. It's important because of what it tells you about the state I was in, or the state my body was in, which sometimes knows things before my brain is ready to acknowledge them. I carry a small folding knife on backpacking trips, an Opinel No. 7, the wooden-handled kind with the orange band that they've been making since the 19th century. I carry it in the left hip pocket of my shorts. I use it to open food packages and cut cord, and occasionally to help with camp tasks that need a blade. It is not anything I think of as a defensive tool. It is not something I have ever held for defensive reasons. At some point during what happened at the lake, I found it open in my right hand without any memory of having taken it out of my pocket, without any memory of having made the decision to open it, without any memory of the transition between it being put away and it being ready. My right hand had made a decision independent of anything I was consciously thinking. I mention this because it is the most honest account I can give of what my body understood that my mind was still in the process of working out. I'd come into the Immigrant Wilderness from the Kennedy Meadows trailhead on the last Friday in August, heading north on a 5-day solo trip. The Immigrant is not the most popular part of the Sierra Nevada. People tend to go to Yosemite or Kings Canyon or the John Muir Trail corridor, and once you're past the first few miles, the trails thin out and the basin gets quiet and stays quiet. I'd planned a route through several high lakes, camping at different ones each night, covering roughly 8 to 10 miles per day. The Immigrant has a character different from the Sierra further south. The peaks are rounder, more heavily fractured, the rock breaking down into sandy soil in the basin floors in a way that the harder granite further south doesn't. The light is different. I've tried to describe this to people who haven't been there, and it doesn't translate well, but the light has a softer quality, less sharp than the high Sierra further south, filtered differently. The lakes sit in rounded granite bowls, and they go a color that falls between green and blue, depending on the hour and the cloud cover, and the reflections in them at evening are very good. I made camp on the second night at a lake above 9,000 feet. I'd reached it in the late afternoon, coming over a saddle from the south, and seeing it suddenly spread out below me, a half-mile of still water in a bowl ringed by talus and low scrub, with a flat area of sand on the eastern shore that was clearly made for a tent. I set up there, cooked my dinner while the sun went down behind the western ridge, drank a mug of tea, and watched the sky go through its evening colors. The loons on the lake called back and forth across the water for about an hour before going quiet. Everything was exactly as it should be. I was in my tent by 9 reading on my phone. The novel I was reading was good, the kind of good where you lose track of time, and I was deeper into it than I'd intended when I finally put the phone down and turned off my headlamp. The darkness inside the tent was complete. Outside, the stars had been thick when I last looked, the kind of density you get above 9,000 feet in the central Sierra on a clear August night. So many of them that the familiar constellations get lost in the background noise. I lay on my back and listened to the lake, which was silent now, and to the wilderness around it, which was its own kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a very different register of sound. The small things in the wind and the occasional crack of stone cooling on the talus. I woke up around midnight. I am certain it was around midnight because I checked my watch, which I hadn't taken off. It was on my wrist, and it read 11:47. I came awake completely, not gradually, in the way that sometimes happens in the backcountry when your body has been attending to something while your mind was away. No sound had woken me that I could name, no disturbance I could point to. Just suddenly awake and alert, with the particular quality of alert that isn't quite anxiety, but isn't quite calm either. I lay still and listened. The lake outside was completely quiet. Not quiet the way it had been when the loons were calling and resting. The quiet had movement in it. The ripple of birds on water, the small sounds of the inlet creek. This was different. The lake was silent in a way that felt total. Even the wind had stopped. Even the inlet creek, which I'd been using as a background sound without registering it consciously, was inaudible. I unzipped the tent and looked out. The sky was full of stars. The granite bowl was pale in the starlight, the water of the lake dark and still. The reflection of the stars on its surface so perfect that the boundary between water and sky was difficult to locate. It was very beautiful in a way that I could observe from a distance without being inside it. The way beauty sometimes presents itself when you are already in another state. Across the lake, at the base of the western talus slope, where the granite met the water's edge, there was a figure standing in the lake. Not at the lake's edge, in the lake. Knee-deep, roughly, in the water, which was shallow along the western shore before the basin dropped off. Standing upright facing the shore where my tent was, completely and absolutely motionless. The shape was human in the general sense. Upright, two-limbed, vertical. But I could not make out the detail at that distance and in that light. Not a face, not clothing. Just the shape of it and the fact of its being there. I crouched in the tent door and looked at it. My brain was doing several things simultaneously. Assessing whether what I was seeing was real, running the explanations. Another camper, a trick of starlight on a pale rock. An animal I was misidentifying due to distance and darkness, and failing to make any of them stick convincingly. The shape was too specific. The placement in the water was too specific. And it wasn't moving in the way that starlight on rock doesn't move, in the way that an animal in water moves with the constant small adjustments of something alive in a medium. It was still with a stillness that was itself strange. I watched it for a long time. Long enough that my crouch became uncomfortable, long enough that the stars moved slightly, long enough that I became cold, the night air at 9,000 feet in August being cold even in summer, and I noticed the cold distantly, the way you notice discomfort when something else has most of your attention. I reached for my headlamp with my left hand. My right hand was already holding the knife, open. I have no memory of taking it out. I pointed the headlamp across the lake and turned it on. The beam reached about halfway across the water, not far enough to illuminate the western shore clearly, far enough to see the surface of the lake, the rings where my headlamp sent ripples of reflection out from my side, in the middle distance where the beam faded into the dark. The shore on the far side was in darkness, but the water between me and the far shore was visible. And in the knee-depth shallows along the western bank, where something had been standing, there was nothing. No shape, no displacement, no shadow where there should have been a shadow. I held the beam on that section of the shore for a long time. Then I swept it north along the bank and south along the bank and found nothing. Then I turned it off. I sat in the tent door with the knife still open in my hand and listened. The lake was still silent. After a few minutes, the creek became audible again, very faint at first and then normal. After another few minutes, something, maybe a small mammal, maybe a bird, made a sound in the scrub to the north, and then gradually, the wilderness around the lake came back to itself, filling in with its small sounds, until the silence that had been there when I woke up was no longer there. I folded the knife and put it away. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I packed my camp, and before I headed out, I walked around the lake. I told myself it was to check the inlet condition, which is a thing I occasionally do. Monitoring inlet flow tells you about the health of the drainage. That's what I told myself. I walked around to the western shore and stood at the water's edge. The lake was shallow here. The granite bottom visible through clear water, clean sand and small stones, the kind of bottom you can read clearly in morning light. And in the sand, about 10 feet out from shore, running from deeper water toward the bank, there were depressions, regular, evenly spaced, following a line, not footprint shaped. They were circular, not oval or elongated, each about the size of a closed fist, spaced like footsteps. They came from the deeper water and approached the bank and stopped approximately 10 feet from shore. Where they stopped was approximately where the thing I'd seen had been standing. I looked at them for a long time. I took a photograph with my phone. Then I shouldered my pack and hiked out. I've told 3 people this story. One said interesting and changed the subject, which is a response I have no use for. One asked if I'd been drinking, and I said no, and they shrugged, and that was that. The third person listened to the entire account without interrupting me once, and when I finished, there was a pause, and then they said, the Miwok had names for the spirits in those lakes. I asked what the names were. They said they didn't remember exactly, but that the general term was something close to trouble. I said, okay. I go back and forth about whether to return to that lake. I've been thinking about it for 2 years. I've planned the trip twice and canceled it both times, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. And going somewhere hoping to find something without knowing what that something is seems like a good way to find the wrong thing. Maybe this year. I don't know yet. That's it for tonight. Subscribe if you haven't yet, hit the bell, and do me a favor, and share this episode with one person who you think would appreciate it. Just one. Text them the link right now, you know who it is. New episodes every Monday and Thursday at 9 in the evening Eastern Time. The California wilderness is out there. Everything in it is out there with it. Be careful in the deep places.